our second video of the week, we are going to continue talking about this 40-year period between the end of the Civil War and the turn of the century. So the last video we spent time talking about the Gilded Age, the Gilded Era, and what is meant by the Gilded Era. So hopefully you remember what that means. So this idea of being, gold on the outside, maybe not so shiny on the inside, and how that reflected in the establishment of big businesses, but also in the establishment of unfortunate working conditions, and also the differences between old and new money, and what that meant for the previous American elite and the new American elite, who was now coming into this time where they made their own money, even if they didn't come from nobility. So those pieces of what the Gilded Era is. So that's kind of one part of what these 40 years between 1870 to 1900, or 30 years in this case, about 30 years, these 30 years look like this Gilded Age aspect. But there's one other thing, well, at least one other thing that contributed to this period, which we're going to talk about today. And that is, as you can tell from the title of this video, is something called American Imperialism. And when we talk about that, we're going to talk about something called the Spanish-American War. But don't worry, this will be one video only about this war. This isn't going to be another week-long, 2-week-long war series. But let's think a little bit about what American imperialism is and what it means. And also how it relates to the Gilded Era, because this isn't a separate period or anything, it kind of overlaps a little bit, and we're going to talk about why. So in the years directly following the Civil War, so the war ends in 1865, and for the first 5, maybe you could even say 10 years, and more like 5, so until around 1870, those 5 years directly after the war, Americans had no desire for any further military operations or ventures. And understandably so. The Civil War had been horrible, had left parts of the country in complete economic and physical turmoil. So the idea of subjecting the country to anything else even remotely similar to the Civil War seemed completely ridiculous and unheard of. So no wars, no fighting, no nothing. Abstain from anything that has to do with that. However, when we learned yesterday about how post-Reconstruction era into the Gilded Era, you start seeing the country growing in urban ways and industrial ways. You get a change in this attitude. So we have for a brief period of time people saying no more military actions, but then as they start to forget the war a little bit, and these all these glittering, golden, exciting opportunities of the Gilded Age start becoming more prominent and more into focus, they start changing their tune about whether or not war is a good or bad thing. So in 1893, one Kentucky newspaper writes that the United States was the most advanced and powerful nation in the world, an imperial republic that was destined to shape the future of the world. So this is kind of an attitude that builds in a period. And this attitude starts going back to around the 1870s. So this period of time during the Gilded Era, following Reconstruction, I want you to think of it as Manifest Destiny Part 2, the International Edition. So let's take it back. What was Manifest Destiny to begin with? So we talked about this right before we started learning about the Civil War. Manifest Destiny was that dream, that ideal, that duty that the Americans had to go and expand westward into the new lands that they had recently purchased, obtained from their wars, the Mexican-American War, the Texas War of Independence. This was their land, so they were supposed to fulfill their God-given duty to settle the new land. So what is Manifest Destiny Part 2 International Edition? Well, instead of looking at territory already owned, so at this point, we had done the Louisiana Purchase, we had won the Mexican-American War, we had annexed all of these territories, so we already had this territory. Now it was just, let's go settle it. But now, Manifest Destiny Part 2 American Imperial Edition, is a different mindset. Now, America has the urge to try and spread the territory that didn't already belong to them, that they hadn't already obtained from somewhere else. they're looking to build themselves an empire. That's what imperialism refers to, being imperial, to having some kind of, big country, world empire, like reminiscent of something of the Greeks and Romans. And even if it meant they had to acquire this land from people who already owned it, or acknowledged people who already owned it, is a kind of important distinguishing there. It didn't really matter. They just wanted more land. They were like kind of hungry for something new to settle. So as it had been before, this kind of new kind of manifest destiny, part two, became not just an ideal, but a duty, and it helped create the mindset in the United States that becomes known as American imperialism. So that's the topic of our video today. It becomes kind of inspired by like this re-emergence of manifest destiny, kind of tweaked a little bit. So it refers to this desire to conquer, because Americans were clearly fit to conquer. They believed they were fit to conquer. This idea that the United States controlling the world and creating an empire was clearly the best thing for both the United States and for the world. So it's this belief that of superiority, in a sense, that comes from this expanded version of manifest destiny into American imperialism. So that's all well and good to give us a picture of like the mental, the theoretic position of the time. We kind of know this is what's happening as we go from the 1870 into the turn of the century. But what does American imperialism look like when put into practice? And that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of today's video. So we're kind of going to have two examples. The first one is a short, small example. And if you'll remember back, I think when we were learning about the Mexican-American War, and I was showing you guys on the map where New Mexico, Arizona, and all those, where the territory was that we annexed during that time, I think some of you asked, what about Alaska? What about Hawaii? Well, we're not at Alaska yet. Eventually we will get there. I think that's in the 60s, maybe 1960s, but that's a little bit in the future. But one good example of what American imperialism looked like in practice was the annexation, make sure I'm spelling this right, and the annexation of Hawaii. Okay, so let's take it back to around 1875. So in 1875, Hawaii was their own kingdom, a unified kingdom. They had their own monarchy, they had their own, laws, everything that they needed to have. And around 1875, they had that. And in the same year, they signed a sugar trade treaty with the United States, because Hawaii, as a Caribbean, or not Caribbean, but as a Pacific island, produces a lot of sugar cane. So it seems they signed a treaty with the United States to, work with them in manufacturing and, shipping sugar. And it seems for a bit that there's not going to be any trouble, that they have a working relationship with each other. However, as Americans start becoming more involved in the Hawaiian sugar trade, more Americans start moving to live permanently in Hawaii. And there becomes a growing white population in Hawaii. So everything's all well and good. And then in 1891, we have a problem. With help from the U.S. Marines, so our army, the white population of Hawaii actually overthrows the Hawaiian monarchy, which at the time is led by a queen, and I'm probably butchering this name a little bit, but I did look it up. Kalani. Liliuokalani, I think is how you say it. Queen Liliuokalani, the last queen of Hawaii. So they overthrow her government, and take over. And those same Americans who overthrew the monarchy petitioned the United States to immediately annex the Hawaiian Islands as part of the United States. And then about 7 years later, after some presidents say, "Oh, I won't do it," other presidents say, "Yes, let's do it." In 1898, despite the protests of the native Hawaiians, so the people who lived there already, who did not want to join the United States, and despite the arguments of many Americans who actually thought this whole coup that the Americans in Hawaii had thrown was completely unjust, President William McKinley in 1898 annexes Hawaii to the United States, saying quite literally, to quote him, "We need Hawaii, it is our manifest destiny." So quite literally admitting that adding Hawaii to the Union is part of this fulfillment of this re-emergence of the manifest destiny ideals. So that's how the United States gets control of Hawaii. It was different from when we annexed Texas, because if you'll remember, a lot of the native Texans, so the Mexicans living in Texas, wanted to join the United States. Some of them didn't, but a lot of them did. In Hawaii, the native Hawaiians wanted nothing to do with this, so they were pretty much forced into that situation. So that's our first and short example. So the annexation of Hawaii sets the ball rolling for our longer, more lengthier example of today. That's in the title of our video, something called the Spanish-American War. And there are people who say that the title of this war is not super accurate because there were other people who fought in the Spanish-American War, including Puerto Ricans, Filipinos, Cubans, and others. So it was more than just between Spain and the United States. But for ease of use, we're going to use this term. But I just kind of want to point out it was more than just these two countries. So I know what you're probably thinking, no more war, we just did one. And that's a fair reaction. It was the same reaction I had when I realized we had to teach this one so soon after wrapping up the Civil War. But don't worry. This Spanish-American War lasts for only 1 year, barely even that. And it's only important for us to think about how it exemplifies this atmosphere of American imperialism that we're discussing in this period. So this is, like I said, example number 2 of what American imperialism looked like in this period. First one was annexation of Hawaii. Second one, the Spanish-American War. All right, so with that being said, what was the Spanish-American War? It's also known as the War of 1898, because that's when it happens, at just 2 years before the turn of the century, kind of wrapping up this century. It's a short war, and it was brought upon largely by accident. So let's talk about how that happened, because it's an interesting story. So let's take ourselves to the Caribbean islands to begin with. We're not on continental USA anymore. We're in the Caribbean islands now. So we're going to take ourselves to Cuba. So the island of Cuba has been under Spanish rule since Columbus. So since 1492, when Columbus, lands in the Caribbean, discovers islands like Cuba. Spain had colonized Cuba and completely controlled it. So this has been, almost 400 years approximately has Spain had control over Cuba. And throughout the second half of the 1800s, so from 1850 onward, Cuba has been trying to rebel against its Spanish rule, and it had kept not succeeding. Spain continues to win and continues to impress the Cuban rebels who want their independence. So in 1895, Cuba starts their War of Independence. They officially declare war against Spain. So at this point, keep in mind, none of this involves the United States of America. This is just context. It's just happening, and we're watching it happen. But in 1895, Cuba says, well, we've had enough. We're going to declare our independence, and we're going to fight for it. So they declare war against Spain in 1895. And they fight this war in a guerrilla warfare fashion. So if you remember guerrilla warfare, we're not talking about straight battles. We're talking about small skirmishes, usually fought in kind of like jungle terrain, and it can last for a long time. So this is all happening, and while it's happening, America is becoming increasingly more aware that it's happening, and part of that reason is because newspapers during this time are seeing a great increase in sensational journalism. So what's sensational journalism? The head of the New York Journal, one of the newspapers, William Hearst, kind of describes what sensational journalism is, and he claims that newspapers had a duty beyond just reporting events and facts. They had a duty to help shape the opinions of the public. In his opinion, newspapers had the power to declare wars, and that's a direct quote from him. So this is a kind of manipulative journalism almost, more about opinions and sensationalism than it is about facts. And it becomes known as yellow journalism. So what does yellow journalism have to do with the Spanish-American War? What does it have to do with Cuba? Well, because yellow journalism is becoming popular at the same time as Cuba is fighting its war for independence. So journalists in the United States are reporting on the stories of Cuba and Spain, and they are publishing sensational, potentially exaggerated stories about this conflict over and over again into the American press. And all over the country, this is happening. They're talking about, the cruelties of Spain, the bravery of the Cubans, and how amazing it is that they're fighting for their independence, and they're doing it in ways that makes America very excited. To the point that America has forgotten that they just had a really terrible war, and they're like, we need to go help Cuba, we need to go be part of this war, the government needs to declare war on Spain, we need to be a part of this. You know, they get very, very excited, a lot of it because of yellow sensationalism journalism. However, while the rest of the country is kind of going nuts like that, the presidents at the time, so there are two presidents, Grover Cleveland first, and then William McKinley, who we mentioned a second ago in relation to Hawaii. But William McKinley, current president, kind of ignores the sensationalism of the journalism and kind of maintains a neutral position. So what that means is that the United States stays on good terms with both sides. We acknowledge Cuba's position and their right to rebel against their oppressors, but we also acknowledge Spain and her claims. So we don't actually take a side at this point. And to be completely honest, it could have been true that this neutrality would have continued. There was no reason why it shouldn't until a certain event happened that forced America's hand in a way. And we're going to talk about what that was. So let's fast forward to January of 1898, so the very beginning of 1898. The U.S. battleship called the Maine, like the state, has docked in the Havana harbor, the Cuban capital. Because remember, we're on good terms still with Cuba, good terms with Spain. We're kind of there on like a courtesy visit. The battleship just docks for whatever particular reason, maybe to get supplies or something like that, in Cuba. And we dock in the Havana harbor. And this is the first thing to remember. Second thing is a few days after the Maine docks in Havana, the Spanish ambassador to the United States, so a person from Spain who has come to the United States to represent Spain, we have one from every country. The Spanish ambassador to the United States wrote a letter to his friend in Havana, and that letter is intercepted, and the contents of the letter are released to the paper, the New York Journal. And they were published, and the contents, to be completely honest, weren't great. So what did this letter say? The Spanish ambassador, so remember the Spanish person in the United States representing Spain, writes to his friend in Havana about President McKinley, and he calls him weak and a bidder for the admiration of the crowd, a would-be politician who tries to leave a door open behind him while continuing to keep on good terms with the warmongers of his party. So what does this mean? Basically, the Spanish ambassador is saying that McKinley is too weak to pick a side in the war, that neutrality is stupid, basically, and that McKinley is trying to play both sides just to keep his own popularity. And whether this is true or not, no one could ever really say. However, this made many people upset. And then, 6 days later, so remember, the Maine is in Havana. A few days later, this letter and Spain's opinion on the States, on the United States and McKinley comes out. Then a few days later, I believe it's on February 15th, the night of February 15th, 1898, an explosion sounds from the U.S. Maine that's still docked in the Havana harbor. It only took a few moments before the explosion, which ruptured into the hull, the bottom of the ship, filled with water, so the ship starts sinking immediately, and it sank before anyone really understood what had just happened. And as it was evening, because like I said, the evening of February 15th, most of the sailors on board the Maine were asleep, they were in bed for the night, they were in their cabins, they didn't know what happened, and most of them end up drowning. So out of the 354 men on board, 260 of them die after the explosion on the Maine. The United States hears about this, and they're convinced immediately that this was Spain's fault, that Spain has just fired the first shot against the United States because the United States has said they want to remain neutral, and now we know the Spanish ambassador thinks that McKinley is trying to play both sides. We know they don't like us, and now we believe that they have just fired on one of our battleships. It actually won't be until years later, in 1974, that the explosion is re-examined, because they dive down, they look at the wreckage of the ship, and they're pretty sure the explosion was actually due to coal. Because these ships ran with coal on the inside, actual coal fires. So they actually don't think it had anything to do with Spain. However, at the time, in 1898, the United States was already itching for a war and itching for an opportunity to be involved in this conflict. And they were basically calling for this tragedy to be the catalyst for what they hoped would be a new and glorious victory for the United States. So what happens following the Maine? At first, President McKinley tries, very unsuccessfully, but first he tries to stay neutral. He tries to say, maybe it was Spain, okay, fine, but it could have been an accident. And he tries to negotiate with Spain. But eventually, people within his own party, the Republicans, the term is warmongers, meaning people who want war. But at the time, the slang word for warmongers was jingoes. So the warmongers, jingoes, is part of his party, kind of get under his skin and convince him that we can't remain neutral anymore. So on April 20th of 1898, just a couple months after the Maine sinks, Congress declares that Cuba, who's still fighting their war of independence, remember, their war is happening, their guerrilla war is happening during all this time. United States Congress declares that Cuba is now officially an independent nation. So we go and we say, and we claim that we have the power to make Cuba independent. And so we demand that Spain withdraw from Cuba immediately or face our consequences. And obviously, you can pretty much tell what happens. 4 days later, on April 24th, Spain declares war on us for declaring Cuba independent. And then on April 25th, we respond and we declare war back on Spain. We declare Cuba's independence, Spain declares war on us, we declare war on Spain. It's a busy week for Congress and for people in Spain and the United States. So in a matter of 5 days, we're basically in war again. And let's talk about this declaration of war for a second, the American declaration of war against Spain, because it has an interesting part to it that's kind of worth taking a moment. So think back for a second to the Texas War of Independence. If you'll remember, one of the main motivations for fighting the Texas War of Independence or for America getting involved in it, was to annex Texas. We were very open that we wanted to annex Texas. Texas was very open that it wanted to be annexed by the United States. However, this time it's different. Cuba is fighting for their own independence as all this, negotiation is happening. And so they're not looking to be annexed by anyone. So when America declares war on Spain, they add something to the declaration of war, something that they haven't really done before. And this is called the Teller Amendment, introduced by Senator Teller, obviously. So the Teller Amendment, simply put, stated that in the course of the war between America and Spain, that involved Cuba, the Americans will not try to annex Cuba. So the idea of annexing Cuba is a complete and no. No, that's not what they're doing. They don't want to annex Cuba. Or at least they're saying they don't. Cuba, they've declared independent and will remain independent if and when they expect to win the war. It's a small difference, but it's interesting to think about. It was proposed in part by politicians who didn't want to see Cuba annexed in the same way Hawaii had been. So people who had been vocal about how annexing Hawaii had been such a problematic thing were now very interested in making sure the same thing didn't happen to Cuba. But even despite that, there is still an attitude of imperialism present in this declaration. Because even though we're saying we're not going to annex new territory, we are still declaring Cuba an independent nation for them. And so the United States is implying here that they have the power to decide who gets to be independent and who does not. So they're taking the role of that imperial world power that can make these decisions for other smaller nations, like Cuba, who can't, even when they're trying to. So on April 25th of 1898, the United States officially declares war on Spain with the Teller Amendment in tow, and the Spanish-American War has officially begun on April 25th. I will be giving you guys a quick war fact sheet like I have for the others to go along with this. So this is a very, very short war. And let's talk about the first victory, the first major battle, first victory. It happens only 5 days after the declaration of war, so April 30th is when we have our first major victory. And guess what? It's not in Cuba. It's not anywhere near Cuba, actually. The victory actually happens in the Philippines. You might be wondering, what on earth are we doing in the Philippines? So let's think about that for a second. So just before the war was declared, so we were 5 days prior, before April 25th, the current Assistant Secretary of the Navy had an idea. And this guy's name, we should recognize, was Theodore Roosevelt. He's currently the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So he has this idea, and he gets in contact with one of the United States Commodores. They're kind of like admirals. They command, Navy ships. Commodore George Dewey. Roosevelt reaches out to Commodore Dewey, and he's like, look, I think we're getting close to declaring war, so start moving your naval ships to the Philippines. Why the Philippines? Because the Philippines were a Spanish colony, and they've been a Spanish colony for about 300 years. And Roosevelt says, start moving your ships toward the Philippines just in case we declare war. Then you can attack them where they're least going to expect it. They will not be expecting a Cuban conflict to move as far as the Philippines, so we can surprise them that way. And of course, Roosevelt's prediction comes through. We declare war. Commodore Dewey makes it to the Philippines 5 days after the war declaration, and before Spain knows what's happened to them, Commodore Perry has attacked Manila Bay, the capital of the Philippines, and has completely defeated the Spanish forces there. So the Battle of Manila Bay on April 30th, 1898, Commodore Perry and his fleet win. And this is the first big major victory in the Spanish-American War. And it comes out of nowhere for Spain and is an interesting military tactic for the United States. So that's our first victory. It's kind of out of the blue because, Philippines, we're not expecting that. But I'll give you a second to take a note on that if you need to write some down. Take a second to process because, went from Cuba to the Philippines in about 5 seconds, and we're going back to Cuba in another 5. All right, so Manila Bay, very quick, easy victory. So easy that a spectator of the battle called it a military execution rather than a real contest. So there was pretty much no fighting. Commodore Dewey won very easily. And that's where we're going to leave the Philippines for now. It's important to note the Battle of Manila Bay, but we're going back to Cuba. Now, so let's take it back to the Caribbean. So at the beginning of the war, the Spanish army stationed in Cuba greatly outnumbers the American army. Because remember, after post-Civil War, we've kind of shrunk the size of our army. We didn't want to fight anymore, so why build an army? But now that we're excited about war again, we have to build our army up again. So we kind of have to supplement our army with volunteers. And probably the most famous of these volunteers, and you'll probably hear this term, is a group of volunteers called the Rough Riders. They were the first volunteer cavalry regiment, so they rode horses. And they were famous because they were such a mixed group of volunteers. They included Ivy League graduates, Irish policemen, ex-convicts, cowboys, and Texas Rangers, as well as a variety of Native American volunteers coming from tribes like the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Pawnee, and the Creek Indians. And this whole group, they were all described as being young, good shots, and good riders. But what's their significance? Why am I mentioning them? Well, because the main reason we remember the Rough Riders in history is because of who was their second in command, a man who we've already mentioned already, once again, good old Teddy Roosevelt. So when we talked about him a second ago, he was the Assistant Secretary to the Navy. Once he finds out war has been declared, he has always been a big proponent of the Spanish-American War. He's been wanting America to go to war for a while, and he quits his government job, joins the army, becomes second in command to the Rough Riders. So that's who the Rough Riders are and why we need to remember them. But now let's think about, so these volunteers are organized. They meet in Tampa Bay, Florida, to kind of get all together, and then they ship out to Cuba. So once we're in Cuba, what happens? So at this point, it's July. July 1st is when the fighting in Cuba really starts. So, we've won in Manila Bay. At this point, the U.S. Navy has blockaded the Spanish Navy in a port known as Santiago. So we've attacked them in the Philippines. We are holding their naval forces in the port called Santiago. We'll mention Santiago again in a second, but that's where our Navy is, some of our Navy is. But now what actually happens on Cuban soil? So on July 1st, still 1898, A group of around 7,000 U.S. soldiers, which includes Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders, set out to take a fortified village called El Caney. As part of the attack, included a charge up a hill to get to the city, and this hill is called San Juan Hill. And we're learning about what San Juan Hill is and the importance of this battle because it's here that Teddy Roosevelt becomes a war hero, and this is referenced a lot because he will later become president of the United States. And he will often be referred to, Teddy Roosevelt, San Juan Hill. Well, what happens at San Juan Hill is that the commander at the time is leading American soldiers up San Juan Hill in kind of a war charge, but then he's killed by a Spanish bullet. And Teddy Roosevelt, little TR, comes over and takes charge and leads the charge instead, even though he himself is also wounded. So he kind of forays forward into the incoming Spanish soldiers, and it's just like this very inspiring scene of bravery for a lot of people who saw it. So Teddy Roosevelt and the charge of San Juan Hill with the Rough Riders kind of starts becoming legendary following the Spanish-American War. So that's why this is being mentioned. So when you think here, if you ever hear San Juan Hill, if you think of the Spanish-American War, these two, be connected. Manila Bay, San Juan Hill are two things that you should associate. But we actually don't end up staying in Cuba very long in that regard because this San Juan Hill happens July 1st. We take El Caney, and then 2 days later, on July 3rd, the Spanish Navy, who, like I mentioned before, is being blockaded in Santiago by the United States Navy, tries to make a run for it. So they try to get out of the Santiago port around the United States Navy. That doesn't work. The American Navy quickly and simply destroys the Spanish Navy with not even that much difficulty. And for Spain, at that point, that was kind of it. And you're thinking, is that it? That's all? That kind of is it, and that's all. Because on July 17th, so 2 weeks after the Spanish Navy is destroyed at Santiago, Spain surrenders. They kind of give up. It doesn't take long. And the war technically only lasted for 114 days. So I said it took 1 year. Well, what I mean is that it only happened within 1 year, 1898. But in reality, it only happens 114 days from April 25th to July 17th. And this will be on the little quick fact sheet that I'll give you. So the war officially ends on July 17th. The official ceasefire comes like a month later, I think. And then by December of that same year, I think on December 10th exactly, this will also be on your sheet, the United States signs the peace treaty, the end of war treaty. We've learned about a lot of treaties at this point. Here's another one for the list, the Treaty of Paris. Treaty of Paris. And the Treaty of Paris basically states, in keeping with the Teller Amendment, that Cuba will remain an independent nation, and that the United States will annex Spanish territories of Puerto Rico and Guam, an island in the Pacific. And we still have those territories to this day in some form or the other. They are still our territories. Eventually, the United States is also going to annex the Philippines, but by 1946, following World War II, the Philippines becomes an independent nation. But in keeping with the theme of American imperialism, even though Cuba is allowed or permitted by the United States to become their own independent nation, we still annex more territory, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And we take all that from Spain. So we've been talking a lot about the American perspective and the Cuban perspective of this, but for a brief second, as we wrap up this video, December 10th, 1898 is not only an important day for Cuba and the United States, it's a very interesting and almost humiliating experience for Spain as well, because this is the day that the Spanish Empire in the Americas comes to a complete end. So it's been 400 years since Columbus started the Spanish Empire in the Western Hemisphere like that. But now it's over. They don't have any of their territories. Because remember, all the Latin American territories have long since become independent. The last things that Spain had were Cuba, Puerto Rico, they had Guam, they had the Philippines. And now that's all gone. So that's also kind of an important thing to keep in mind from the Spanish perspective of this war. So for Americans, this was, I think when a newspaper called it a splendid little war that was fought with good motivations, good intentions. It was a great victory for the country. For Spain, this was completely humiliating because it officially kind of knocked their status a little bit as a world power. And it's also important to note that even though the war was short and seemed simple, 114 days, the casualties certainly weren't. So more than 60,000 Spanish soldiers and sailors died of wounds or disease, and a lot of them were actually due to disease more than battle wounds. So malaria, typhoid, dysentery, yellow fever were all very prominent diseases, especially in the heat of the Cuban kind of jungle and terrain, or in the Philippines as well. Some 10,500 Cubans died. Over 5,000 Americans died, and most of those were also from disease, not battle. When America tried, we're not going to talk about this in detail, but when America tries to annex the Philippines, unlike Puerto Rico and Guam, the Philippines actually resist for about 3 years, so we don't officially annex them until 1901, 1902. And during those 3 years, as we're kind of fighting a guerrilla war in the Philippines for, something that we supposedly liberated from Spain, but now just want to keep for ourselves, we lose a lot of soldiers there too. A lot of native Filipino civilians die, a lot of Filipino soldiers die, a lot of Americans also die there as well. So the Spanish-American War had, albeit short, had longer reaching consequences. And such was the cost of the United States imposing their ability to exist as an imperial nation. So that is American imperialism, that is the Spanish-American War, and that is why we talk about the Philippines when we talk about the Spanish-American War. And if you didn't know that the United States controlled the Philippines for a decent amount of time, now you know, and you know why. So that kind of wraps up this kind of period in time between the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction era going into the turn of the century. In our next little short video, we're going to talk about women's suffrage movement after the turn of the century in the early 1900s. So stay tuned for that. But you don't really have a choice. If you want to stay tuned for that, you gotta. But I will see you in my next video, or I'll have a YouTube video for you to watch instead. See you soon.